Joining us now live to discuss these tax cuts is Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union. Pete, thank you for joining us. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, we heard her describing this plan as the largest tax cut in history for middle-class working Americans. How do you see Trump's current plan, especially in comparison to his actions from his first term?
Well, it's certainly a good place to start to renew the best pro growth elements of the 2017 law that President Trump signed. Those include the child tax credit, the rate reductions, the corporate tax rate reduction, full and immediate expensing for businesses. That's a real time saver, saves a lot of record keeping headaches. These are important priorities that need to be put front and center for the American people. The so-called reconciliation process, which sets revenue and spending levels and allows Congress to proceed with the details of these tax cuts, needs to happen soon. And we think it would be a mistake to try and separate out a lot of issues and have two reconciliation bills. We need the one big, beautiful package that the president had described earlier in order to move these priorities forward. Otherwise, we're going to get bogged down with a lot of distractions.
Absolutely. Talking about the trickle-down effect of these policies here, right? There's eliminating taxes on tips, overtime pay, Social Security benefits. Just how much of an impact can everyday Americans see in their day-to-day lives if these cuts are implemented?
Well, the impact of those campaign trail promises actually would pale in comparison to some of the 2017 law's provisions, which are expiring at the end of this year. For example, exempting tip income sets up all kinds of administrative problems, and we're probably better off actually cutting rates on individuals a little further or increasing the child tax credit so families that depend on gratuities for some of their income at work can actually get tax relief that way than setting up another complex system that could be very difficult to enforce. Now, when it comes to Social Security, well, it's never been smart to tax benefits that you're already taxed for in the first place. But maybe a middle ground there is to set up a system where, as you make more money in retirement, you get a little less in Social Security benefits. After all, that whole system threatens to go belly up about a decade or so from now. We need to be thinking about how to save Social Security for the vast majority of Americans, and maybe having some sensible limits on those benefits would help to do that.
Right. And what about for small businesses? What kind of tax incentives for U.S. made products that Trump is proposing? How could they benefit small businesses?
They could certainly benefit small businesses because we need to stop thinking about massive, large corporations as being the sole beneficiaries, for example, of a lower corporate tax rate or this full and immediate expensing provision. The truth is that small businesses are often the biggest part of the large businesses' supply chains. They're the subcontractors and others who supply the materials and the technical know how to some of America's largest corporations. They need to benefit from tax relief too.
Absolutely. Small businesses really are the backbone of the U.S. Pete, I want to ask you about Trump reportedly also wanting to adjust the state and local tax deduction cap. Tell us more about that.
Well, the state and local tax deduction, also called SALT, was limited in the 2017 law that the president signed to $10,000. You could only deduct that much. Well, that's prompted a backlash from some blue state Republicans saying it should be way higher, maybe $200,000. Well, that would be ridiculous for a number of reasons. You're giving away tax relief to very wealthy households, even as you're struggling to provide ways forward to make tax rates lower for everybody. And besides, in those blue states, the taxpayers living there, even though they had this cap on salt, uh, got to reduce their taxes other ways, lower rates, plus 5 million taxpayers, mostly living in blue states, were paying this dreaded alternative minimum tax, a whole complex parallel tax system. The 2017 law dramatically reduced the number of people subject to that tax. Those are benefits that we should be touting and saying we need to preserve those rather than raising a cap on state and local taxes that would effectively reward tax hikers in those blue states.
Right, Pete, looking back for a second to larger companies or the billionaires in the countries, the president has also said that he wants to close this carried interest loophole. Now, tell us more about that and how this compares exactly to similar past efforts to change tax loopholes.
Carried interest is one of those perennial so called pay fors in tax relief bills. In fact, Democrats have proposed doing this a number of times, sometimes in multiple instances on the same bill, counting the revenues that would supposedly come in 2 or 3 times. This is not the way to provide good tax relief across the board by singling out one category of American business and saying suddenly you have to pay more. Better to focus on things that benefit all businesses. And even if we're talking about ways to offset the revenue impact, by reducing rates and perhaps clawing back certain deductions, it needs to be done in a fair and broad based manner. That's why the limit on salt, for example, was so successful.
Right. Before we go here, I want to ask you this. The president, we've heard him many times say that he'll use tariffs to offset the costs of tax cuts. Now, of course, we've seen criticism of this, we've seen support of this. How do you see this proposal?
Using tariffs to offset tax cuts is simply robbing Peter to pay Paul. If you levy a tariff, it's not the other country paying it, it's the consumers in our country, the businesses in our country who need raw materials from abroad, the workers in our country at those businesses that end up getting idled. What you're doing is essentially placing that tax, which could be several $1,000s per household, depending on which countries are targeted and how high the rates are. And that just totally offsets the $2,000 or more in tax relief that extending the 2017 law would provide. So, why do that?
Absolutely. Well, we'll see what comes out of the Republicans' reconciliation bill. Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union, thank you.
My pleasure.